Welcome to the Creative Life Story Work podcast, where we explore how a creative approach to life story work can help children and young people who have been in care make sense of their past and build a brighter future. A new model for life story work is being rolled out in the northeast of England, and this podcast shares the latest learning and investigates how it could help improve the lives of care-experienced children and young people across the country. My name is Dawn Williams, and I am an associate at Blue Cabin, one of the partners on this exciting work in the region. Today we are asking the question, telling it like it is? And discussing with me, I'm delighted to say, is my friend, colleague and creative facilitator, Mary Robson. Mary has been working alongside other artists on the Creative Life Story work at Blue Cabin, and you're very welcome this morning, Mary.
Thank you, Dawn.
My role at Blue Cabin as part of Creative Life Story work has been working alongside the artists to think about what support needs to be in place for them to best approach Creative Life Story work. And one of the biggest themes that comes out of our conversations is around different sorts of spaces to reflect. You've been working with our artists as well, and I wondered if we could start our conversation by thinking about that, the need to have that sort of a space.
As you know, I'm passionate about reflective practice, really, and that comes from my experience of being a freelance solo facilitator years ago, and coming across situations that were difficult and having nowhere to take them. And so how was I going to develop as an individual and as a practitioner? Because as we know, and especially in this kind of work, I think reflective practice is a life skill rather than a chore to be done at the end of the day.
We've got about 11 artists working with us at the minute, and at first one of the conversations would be, oh yes, I think about the session that I've just done as I'm driving home in the car. And I wondered if one of the things that we're investigating is there any more robust frameworks that we could be giving to artists to think about where to place the experiences and the stories that they've heard in the Creative Life Story work sessions that they've been taking part in.
And this would also be relevant, wouldn't it, to other kinds of practitioners too. The most compelling definition I've ever read of reflective practice was by a woman called Joy Amulya, from what was then called the Centre of Reflective Community Practice, MIT, that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I discovered this definition a long time ago, and it's become a bit of a mantra for me. She says, and I'm going to quote her here, reflection is an active process of witnessing one's own experience in order to take a closer look at it, sometimes to direct attention to it briefly, but often to explore it in greater depth. And I think she goes on to say, and is very clear, that this doesn't have to be always in retrospect, but can be before, during, or after. And I think having some kind of framework where it's made clear to practitioners that all of those things are the nuts and bolts of reflection is probably really useful. Again, I remember talking to nurses about nursing training a long time ago, and they had to keep a reflective journal at the end of every day, but they were marked down if it said anything that was, inverted commas, negative. So i.e. if you said, I'm having real difficulty with the patient in bed 5, and I don't know how to cope with that, that would be perceived at that time as being a negative thing to be judged. And I think for me, the whole point of reflective practice is to be able to speak the unspeakable in order to understand it, and in order that something gets done about it.
I'm remembering working in a lanterns workshop up at Reckington and being on a table with a child who I was finding very difficult, and was trying my best to not snap at this child. But I do remember that almost it was unconscious as a team of artists. We would just put our hand up, a signal, and just go, swap. So in that instant, you're trying to be genuine with that child so that they can have the best experience of making a lantern, but knowing in that instance that actually you're not the person to be doing that. That's quite hard in a workshop to do that.
I think it is hard. I think we're all, in some ways, like those nurses were being, in a way, conditioned to think that you can be the same with everybody. And you really, I think you hit on absolutely the right point there, which is the important thing is that the child or the person does not in that moment feel judged in any way, and that you are ethically as well dealing with it, so that it's not about pretending to care. It's the care involves involving other people in that moment. You know what I mean? So it's broadening that definition of care, I would say, as well within those contexts, so that people are really well looked after, and that attention is paid to when that care is needed and by whom. And you're right, that's, for me, a classic example of reflective practice in practice, which is that you have a kind of agreement with the other people in the environs that that's not only acceptable, but is actually the right thing to do in that moment.
One of the other questions that comes up with the artists, the team of associate artists that were working, and what I've noticed is that there is a need for different sorts of spaces to do that processing in, whether that's an online one on Basecamp, whether it's an informal WhatsApp group, whether it's formal supervision, and there's an absolute need for all of those. And I'm just wondering about who it is that you have these conversations with, who do you deliberate with, and how do we pass it on to the next generation of social workers, artists, nurses who are all collaborating together?
I think this also kind of intersects with, I know, something you always point out to people, which is that grid between the personal and the professional. And I think it's, first of all, it's really important, especially when if people are freelance, but it's important, to decide what is personal to you and what is professional. That's really crucial. But also, in terms of being freelance, it's about taking responsibility for your own well-being and development too. So I would add another kind of grid in there as well, which is around what is my responsibility for me, and what is my responsibility for my practice. So, for example, some different spaces that can be considered. I started having what was called supervision, professional supervision, when I was a freelance. That was me looking after me, because I realized there were lots of transitions between projects or situations that happened when I was working, and I didn't have anybody to take it to necessarily. And that was developing my practice. Now, that was with somebody who was trained also in person-centered counselling, and she made it her business, therefore, to take that kind of unconditional positive regard in terms of what was happening in that space. Also, importantly, that space isn't just about problem solving. It's not just about what went wrong. It's also about celebrating. I think that's one of the things we don't do, is we don't look to what we did right, or we don't think, oh, actually, that's a sign that I've developed because I've done it. It's not on my to-do list. I've actually done something. So there's that. And that's, I think, an individual's responsibility. Now, I also know that Blue Cabin have taken that very seriously for their employees. And another space is that people are offered that debrief, reflective space as part of their professional commitment, which I think is laudable, absolutely laudable. But also, I think there's a lot you can do in cahoots with whomever you're working. So as we've said, having agreements within the moment of how you deal with things in workshops, etc. But also there are templates around how to reflect at the end of the day using some very simple, straightforward systems that may appear to be onerous in the first place, like, a bit like filling in the evaluation form at the end of a workshop. But actually, when you get a body of that together, it really shows you how far you're moving on and how useful it is in your practice, because you don't just dump things in whatever the remote bin is in the corner of your mind. You're actively engaging with it. So going back to what Amulya says before, you're actively engaging with it, And then there's also, you can be doing that on your own, and then you can be doing it as a group. So again, I know Blue Cavern have really excellent practice around this, where artists can come together as a group and learn from each other as facilitators too.
You were talking about the different lenses of the professional and the personal. At Blue Cabin, social pedagogy principles run through a lot of the work, and they would add a third lens in there called the private, some things that you don't share. And so I'm wondering between those three, if there was those three boundaries, how do you negotiate the difference between the distance between those boundaries, because they're ever shifting depending on the child that you're working with or the other adults in the space, and I'm wondering what's that process of negotiating that with yourself and the other people that you're working with?
I think reflection leads naturally to that. I think it then becomes really clear. For example, we might all be very clear about something like a disclosure of some kind from a child in a workshop. That immediately, and also we're all kind of cognizant of what we need to do in that case, and we all know about talking to children and young people, I assume, around when they say, "Will you keep it a secret?" and you say no, because if it's around the care of you, then no. I will talk to others about it because I care about you and what happens to you. And again, I think that notion of private and public is a real life skill that I don't think gets talked enough about with children and young people. Witness now all the problems around social media, around what is private and what is public, for example. I think reflective practice, by getting things out into the open, makes it really clear what needs to be private and not. There may be things that are just too much information about oneself, but on the whole, we need to be able to delve into our experience in order to be curious about it. So I think that curiosity should override any concerns about whether it's private or not. The other thing is to always give people the opportunity to edit what it is they write before they share it. I think this is one of the things you and I've learned, haven't we, in some of the methods we use, where you give people time on their own and then you say, what do you want to share? And at that point, those people are making decisions about their own data, which is really important.
And certainly that's what is offered to some of the children in creative life story work sessions. In some of them, might be about your dreams for the future. And the choice is always given. You can put it in the golden envelope or you could share it with the group, but you don't have to. And it always makes my heart sing when you see some children hold it and go, no, I'm going to put this in a very special place because actually it's mine and I don't want to share it. So that was an example in practice of that happening. Um, I wondered. I know that the conversation that we often have is around a term that you use called everyday ethics, and I wonder if this is another, like reflective practice, whether this is another starting point or a useful frame for the conversation around telling those stories, because it's the stories that we're working that are being brought into the space of those children's stories. They are the authors and they get to edit them, but I'm wondering if we use that as a starting point, is that something that supports use of reflective practice?
Yes, I think, because I don't think you can be ethical without being reflective, and vice versa, in my view. A lot of people's views of ethics are that they're text based, i.e., if you're doing a research project, or if you've got professional codes around ethics, around which is um, moral behavior, basically. Um, but I believe again that the instance, for example, you gave before of the working with that child who you're not feeling aligned with, that is a classic, all not only of reflective practice but also of everyday ethics. Because again, you're not allowing that situation to fester. You're not allowing it to get to a point where it wouldn't be a positive experience for that young person. But ethically, you're doing something about it in that moment. So I think that all of those little decisions that are made moment to moment are, in fact, also ethical ones. And rather than framing things as, I don't know, positive or negative, good and bad all the time. It's actually around finding one's way through. So again, the kind of roles you might have as a facilitator or as a social worker or as another practitioner, we could all kind of have a bit of a list of when we have to be an advocate, or when we're a bit of a teacher, or when we're this or when we're that. It's also having that awareness of how you um, skip from one of those to the other, which is the most appropriate in which setting. So for me, yes, everyday ethics really, really applies alongside and threaded through reflective practice too.
I'm reminded, Mary, of something you said earlier on about a reflective journal being completed and it being seen as negative if less than positive accounts were being written in the journal. I'm wondering about the sharing of accounts, what gets told, who's doing the telling, but also what's being withheld as well, what is not being told, and how we begin to take account of that in the work that we're doing as artists, social workers, foster carers.
I think, kind of ethically speaking, sometimes some of the emotional work, some things around those roles that don't necessarily need to be made public beyond yourself or an immediate, an immediate group. But sometimes writing those accounts for a more public audience answers your previous question around legacy too, around people learning from practice. Because we're talking about learning here from everyday practice, not simply from books. So that in itself can be really useful to others and indeed ethically driven. I think the thing about whose truth is it, or who says what when, is endlessly fascinating. I think we all withhold things, whether that's a reaction to something in the moment, or those moments where you think, "Oh, I wish I'd said that." I was reading the Jamaican poet Kai Miller's latest book recently, which is all about what is withheld, and some great examples in there about how, and he's recounting stories from the past where, for example, one white woman comes in when he's working as a black Jamaican, and he's got some music playing in a cafe, and she comes in and she makes a remark about the music, that it should be switched off, and looks at him in this very pointy way. And he points out that at the time it was known that lots of Jamaican music was, or a certain strand of Jamaican music was homophobic. And that in the moment she is, she's doing what she thinks is the right and truthful thing, which is to get the music switched off because it's offensive. What she doesn't know and what he doesn't say is that he is a Jamaican, obviously black, and also queer. So in that moment, lots of things are being withheld. And I just thought that was a great example, which he comes to in retrospect. And he does so without judgment of that woman, because he says she was doing what she thought was right. And his view isn't to harm anyone in the process. And again, we could say ethically, we don't want to do any harm. But also in all of these delicate negotiations within our everyday sessional experience, whether it's with colleagues or with young people and children, things are being withheld for lots of different reasons. And it's not necessarily about, I don't think, about excavating everything to dig them out. And like you said, the child that holds the golden envelope is an example of withholding in a really positive light. But I think it demands an awareness that we're never going to know all the truths at any one time. It's never going to be a definitive one. And I think that helps us not be seen as the expert all the time too, that we know best.
And I suppose that brings us back to the very first point that we were talking about recognising what it is that you're bringing into the room when you step into that space, into whatever role that is, that, you know, and that, to go back to your personal, professional and private, that can change at every session, what it is that you're bringing in. But also the other people in the room are also bringing that whatever has happened will be in the room, that all needs to be navigated navigated and held in the room as well. So Mary, thank you so much for a rich conversation this morning, trying to tease out reflective practice, everyday ethics, and telling it like it is. It's been a pleasure to have you in the studio this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for asking me. It's been a delight.
Whether you're a foster carer, someone who has experience of the care system, or you work with children and young people, we hope this episode has given you an insight into how we could make life story work better for young people. You can find out more about our show at wearebluecabin.com/podcast, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can record and send a direct question or message to the show via the website. Tweet us at @wearebluecabin, or if you are one of the 1,500 people taking part in our Creative Life Story Work Learning Programme, you can always get in touch through the online learning platform. If you'd like to listen to future episodes, remember to subscribe wherever it is you usually get your podcasts. And if you're using Apple Podcasts, please do leave us a review, as it really helps others to find our show. Bye for now.